This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me we're not telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
Wow, I'm actually doing one of these, huh? And not only that, it's a Friday show with two, count 'em, two reviews. How about that? It's a glorious evening, I have to say. Got my iPhone charging port wet, which is grand. Starting to actually get a little concerned because if I can't get the thing to charge properly, I'm probably going to have to take it in to get it looked at. At that point, Verizon will probably just tell me to buy a new phone, which I am absolutely not in the market for right now. 'Tis not in the budget. But you know how it'd be. You know, right now the battery life seems to be fine, but I don't want to take anything for granted. You know, they say to wait at least several hours before trying to charge it again. But that's like Spencer Shea asking the elevator mechanic how long it'll take to actually fix the elevator. Could be 3 or 4, maybe 5. So that's how my Monday evening's gone so far. Hope everybody else is doing semi-remotely well. You are tuned into the Five Starr Wrestling Report, the wrestling podcast no one knows but everybody needs. As noted, you are getting an actual Friday show this week. And by that I mean 2 semi-shorter reviews of WCW and Midsouth. But you still get 2 segments. There was a part of me that thought, why am I even bothering with reviewing a 30-minute episode of WCW Saturday Night? But then I thought about it again, and I was like, well, you know, we have missed a couple weeks. I hate getting into the habit of not reviewing something for multiple weeks on end. So I'm going to dive into things here and try to preserve the battery life as much as possible on my phone, because I still don't know when this thing's going to cooperate. Also, I'm noticing that my internet is going in and out, which is also epic. Before you know it, the power is going to go out too. Then we'll really be in good standing. So I think I already talked about the next several episodes of WCW Saturday Night. You got a handful of shorter hour-long episodes. I think for the entire month of May, the TBS Saturday Night shows are only an hour in runtime. In addition to that, we've also got this Capital Combat pay-per-view coming up on the 19th, which I'm still trying to work logistics of how I want to actually tackle that. Problem is, I'm going to be away that weekend in Youngstown to do a 2-day gig. Typically, when it comes to situations like that, I just say I won't even bother with the Friday show. But the thing is, it is a pretty major pay-per-view event in WCW's history. And I have been relatively stable with trying to cover the big pay-per-view events for all the retro shows we do. I think the one exception was last year's Starrcade, which was completely undoable for me being out of town for over a month straight. So I think what I'm going to do is, you know, when that Friday show happens in 2 weeks, I'll watch Capital Combat sometime between Monday and Tuesday night. I'll record the review of it, and that particular Friday show will just be the Capital Combat rundown. So in other words, I won't do Midsouth that week. But that'll at least give me time to watch the show and do a full review of it and not have to completely eliminate yet another Friday show. So that is the game plan, at least provisionally. If something changes, I'll keep you informed, but do plan on getting a Capital Combat pay-per-view recap in a couple weeks. With that said, let's go over some of what happened on this week's Saturday TBS show. For one, we began with an awkward jump cut in the tape, straight into the opening match, which I presume was an editing thing on whoever taped and uploaded the show. It was not the network version, I can tell you that. I don't even think the network version exists anymore. And they're still uploading old Crockett footage on the WCW YouTube channel from what I remember. In any case, the match is Doom versus William Bell and Bob Cook. It was about 95% of Doom beating on poor William Bell. Then Cook came in there and ate the fall in the last minute. So I'm thinking William Bell might have owed Doom trans or something. Or perhaps Butch and Ron were in the mood for some true, authentic black-on-black hate crime. So one of the topics the announcers mentioned here was the special stipulation match they added in the last week. Originally, they were planning on just doing Doom versus the Steiners for the World Tag Belts. But then they added the little wrinkle of doing Paul Ellering versus Teddy Long in a hair versus hair match, which was basically a last-minute attraction feature to try to bump up some additional ticket sales. Bearing in mind that Teddy had already lost the majority of his hair by this point. Didn't really take much forethought to see where that was all going. Plus, Ellering was practically bald himself. It's not like we had never seen Paul Ellering without hair before. In a way, it almost sounded like they were undermining the Doom Steiners aspect of the feud in favor of the managers, which I think is a topic I brought up before. It was when they were doing the Road Warriors Doom program a while back. The fact that they seem to be pushing more of the issue between Ellering and Long as opposed to the issues between the two teams. I think it might have also been a way for them to get some heat back on Doom at the pay-per-view. Because unless I'm mistaken, I think that's when Doom win the belts from the Steiners, right? I don't remember much about Teddy getting his head shaved. So that must have been a fairly quick angle. Their promo afterward was pretty good. Although they did their damnedest to spam the Robocop talking point to a ridiculous degree. Wasn't bad enough that JR had to open by mentioning the tagline of the event. Then Teddy had to follow it by immediately saying, "Big things are about to happen at Capital Combat." Aside from the return of Robocop. We all know what the priority was. And trust me, don't worry. We will talk about Robocop plenty over the next few weeks. But Teddy ran down the stipulation match one more time. Vowed that there was no way Paul was going to shave his head. Ron Simmons went off on the idea of pressure, and how the only pressure that exists is on the Steiners when they have to step in the ring with Doom. He also talked about college football and things that sort of went over my head. With me being a sports fanatic and all. Sarcasm. And then Butch basically reiterated some of Simmons' talking points. It was not anything remarkably great. So in hindsight, it really wasn't a good promo segment. I don't know where I got the idea that it was. It was okay. We did get a great videotape afterward. Now, this is notable for a couple reasons. In addition to the story angle they were getting over here, I'm not sure which syndicated program this aired on. I don't think they ever put up a graphic for it. But this marked the official return of one Tony Schiavone to the commentary team. That's right. Tony Schiavone, no longer a WWF employee as of this point. He did his time up north and now he's back serving time in the hellscape of Jim Herd's WCW. Talk about boneheaded moves. And I'm not going to sit here and proclaim to have all the answers as to why Tony decided to leave the WWF after only having been there for a year. My understanding was that even though he was being paid a pretty lucrative deal at the time, he didn't particularly like living in Sanford. Also, I don't think the WWF style was Tony's forte. Especially having called such great action in WCW during the peak years of Crockett Promotions. Like having him go up there to call the WWF style of match, it was probably a step down in his eyes. Maybe that's projection. But there is probably a modicum of truth to it as well. The big thing, though, is definitely living in Connecticut. But there's also the story that's been pretty public about how, when Tony took the offer from Herd and came back to WCW, it was only within a matter of weeks he realized he fucked up. Because he saw just how bad things were down there and realized, well, this sucks. And I think he had several phone conversations with Vince, basically begging to get his old job back, which Vince denied and told him, sorry, pal, can't do anything for you. And you could even tell, as Tony was calling the match with Flair and Luger, it was Tony's voice, but you could tell that his heart really wasn't in it. Despite that it was still a Flair-Luger match. He could just tell that things were not good with the product as a whole. But despite how terrible it was, there is something to be said about longevity. And when it comes to Tony Schiavone, he had multiple stages over his life in the next decade of just being miserable and downright cynical of the product. But even so, he still wound up sticking it through to the bitter end. All the way until 2001 when the company finally folded. So you gotta respect the grind. So they set up the Flair-Luger match by talking about Luger initially being slated to defend the U.S. heavyweight title. I think it was against Dirty Dutch. Doesn't matter. What ended up happening was Ole came out and bought off the contract, so that way he could stick Flair in his place to wrestle Luger instead. I think it was still technically a U.S. heavyweight title match, even though that also didn't matter by the end of the segment. And so we get Luger and Flair working together for a bit with Sting on the floor watching at ringside. Eventually they get to the spot where Luger's about to put Flair away with the rack. But then Ole and Arn hit the ring for the disqualification. And that set up a series of post-match angles with Sting getting involved, only to have his knee get targeted by Flair. In addition to that, probably the more important detail in all of this, we also had the return of Barry Windham. came down and immediately went after Luger, basically establishing himself as the Fourth Horseman and, well, what was already a three-man group anyway, now that they had properly disposed of Sting in the last month. So it is another incarnation of the Four Horsemen, even though Barry had already been a member previously. But even so, we talked about how old he was in wrestling full-time anyway at this point. So when you take him out of the equation, it was still primarily Arn, Rick, and Barry as the core wrestlers. Although I think Arn was still hurt at this point. And they did talk about adding a new member in the near future, in addition to Barry. And I won't spoil who that ends up being, but there you go. Yeah, Barry Windham's back. Another recent WWF contract expiration after Barry left WCW last year to go work for Vince. I for one, never understood what led to Barry leaving in the spring of '89. Literally just to go work for Vince and do fuck all of nothing for like 10 months. Well, you think about it. What did Barry actually do in the WWF in 1989? I'm well aware of his first run with Rotunda when they did the US Express thing. That was at least semi-successful. There was also the late 90s run when he came back as the Stalker, which, well, the less said about that run, the better. But that 89 run was so weird. It may have had something to do with the Turner regime change. Maybe Barry thought the grass would be greener on the other side. Who knows? Point is, he's back. He had to share the spotlight with the Horsemen in their pre-tape promo afterward when they all had a laugh at the babyface's expense. God, seeing Ric Flair with a ponytail, it is such a strange visual. Like, I knew he had already grown his hair substantially long by this point, but actually seeing him with the slicked back ponytail, it was so odd to look at. It was almost as weird as seeing him with shorter hair later this year when Hurd made him finally cut his hair. Which is a conversation that we will save for when the time comes. But at least the Horsemen are back at full strength now. And by that I mean the group is actually a true four-man stable, as opposed to 2.5, with Ole serving as the part-time worker. And so that brought us to the six-man tag with Kevin Sullivan, Cactus Jack, and Bam Bam Bigelow versus Rocky King, Paul Drake, and Johnny Rayner. God, there's another name I completely forgot about making a return. Fucking Bam Bam Bigelow, dude. He came out of the woodwork, didn't he? When's the last time we saw Bam Bam in WCW? Going back to like early '89? And he was being managed by Humperdinck? I mean, it's been well over a year. He was considerably large here. I mean, Bam Bam was always a big guy, but I think it'd be more appropriate to say he was quite rotund at this stage of his career. And they billed him at well over 400 pounds, but I don't think that was gimmicked. All that said, he was still moving fine. That was sort of the appeal when it came to Bam Bam's agility. I mean, he was always a reasonably great athlete for a guy his size. And that's why most people coin him one of the greatest big men workers of all time. Like, I definitely remember him trimming down a bit before he went back to the WWF. Not that surprising. So they beat on the job guys for a while and ended up going over with a weird-looking double-team spot at the end. It was kind of botched, but Sullivan went to try to backdrop Johnny Rayner into Bam Bam so he could catch him in a powerbomb position. It sort of went according to plan. And by that I mean Bam Bam caught Rayner upside down with his head like 2 inches from the ring mat. Then he just kind of fell with him in his arms to make it look like a powerbomb. They still won. Oh yes, we talked about Humperdinck a minute ago too. Yeah, he was also out there. The most sporadically booked manager of the 90s, it seems like. The manager without a purpose. I don't know. I always liked Humperdinck, but I mean, we see him occasionally on these old retro reviews, but it always seems like he's there for a little bit, and then he'll be off of television for over a month straight. And he's always managing different guys with no explanation. Like, remember he randomly showed up and started managing the Samoan SWAT team right as they phased Paul Lee out of the picture, but they never actually addressed how Humperdinck took over as their manager. Now he's back out there with Bam Bam because they have previous history. So why not? Be that as it may. I hate that phrase, by the way. Such a stupid saying. Be that as it may. I actually had a colleague that used to get pissed off when people would say, "It is what it is." He used to say that all the time just to piss him off. Anyway, they did Tommy Rich versus Bill Ford, which thankfully lasted all of 30 seconds. That way I didn't have to watch Tommy bore the brakes off of me in a 5-minute TV squash. They're still doing this feud with him and Outlaw Deaton, which I believe they started on TV a couple weeks ago, seemingly out of nowhere. And so after Rich beat Ford, they immediately went into this impromptu fight between Rich and Deaton. Once the announcers got fed up calling Joel Deaton working over Tommy Rich for an hour and a half, they began talking about who? You guessed it. Robocop. Because we had to make sure we forced that topic down people's throats nonstop throughout this program. God. I don't think we got through one segment on this 45-minute show without some mention of Robocop. It was giving me flashbacks to when the WWE kept mentioning the network in like every segment on Raw in the mid-2010s. It became a meme. It was so ridiculous. I mean, Robocop was quite literally the 90s version of the $9.99 subscription joke. Remember when Stephanie would go out there every week on Raw and talk about how WWE Network is available for only $9.99 a month? That's what this Robocop shit is like. So Tommy Rich won with a flash roll-up after being destroyed for 3/4 of the match. Then, of course, because we hadn't already seen enough of Joel Deaton getting heat, he had to pile drive Rich after the fact and leave him laying. I'm still missing the part where anybody's supposed to remotely care about the idea of Outlaw Deaton being a top heel in the NWA. Like, nothing against the guy, but What are we doing here? This is the kind of stuff they're coming up with in 1990. A Joel Deaton push. That's what we needed. The guy's biggest claim to fame otherwise was being a masked Thunderfoot for 3 years straight. It's not like we're talking about the pinnacle of top talent here. He was a solid worker. That's about it. But that took us to the final segment, as it turns out. Again, very short program. Most of what we saw in the actual syndicated portion of the program wasn't all that significant outside what took place here. At least they went home with something big, to a lesser degree. So Jim Cornette introduces the Freebirds. This is fresh off that big 2 out of 3 falls match when they had their match with the Rock and Roll Express a couple weeks back. Still a really enjoyable TV main event, even though the show as a whole was long as fuck and did not need to be a 3-hour special. And even though the Birds lost that match, they immediately went after Morton and Gibson to establish that the feud had not been resolved. So they B-rolled a tape of the Freebirds going after Gibson and Morton again on the NWA Worldwide program. Whipped them both with leather straps to set up the big stipulation for the pay-per-view match in a couple weeks. It is going to be the Birds versus the R&R, and I believe what they are billing as a corporal punishment match, which is basically just a fancy way to coin a strap match. And albeit the segment got a little hokey at the end, I still loved it because, Jim Cornette is an absolute genius when it comes to selling and making comedy bits come across as organic and natural. So you got Hayes and Garvin out there talking shit about the Express and how they're going to whip them like nobody's business. And right as JC's about to chime in with his thoughts, you see the Birds both hightail it out of the ring as the Rock and Roll come in with the straps. And of course, JC's totally oblivious to the whole thing. So he turns and sees Garvin and Hayes on the floor. And when he does the dramatic turn to look at Ricky and Robert standing behind him, he does the comical fat manager flop and leaps into the air to bump on his ass. And while he's trying to sweet talk the Rock and Roll to put them over, Ricky's doing the promo over him, trying to build up suspense that they're going to whip JC with their leather straps. Then Corny rolls out of the ring at the last minute and does the hightail up the ramp with his arms extended outward. Complete cartoon character. The best part was when Ricky went to ask, "Who is the greatest team in the NWA, Jim?" And of course, Cornette wants to say the Midnights. So he initially says, "Well, the Express, of course." Then as Ricky and Robert smack their palms with the straps, Corny, to save his own skin, goes, "Oh, the Rock and Roll Express, obviously. That's what I meant to say." Again, it was goofy, but it worked. And I got to credit Ricky and Robert for being able to get through that thing without laughing. Like, knowing how much mutual respect these guys had for each other, seeing them interact like this and be able to pull it off without breaking character, that's admirable. So this is all fine. True, nobody got their asses whipped here, but you got to save something for the pay-per-view, right? Cornette's already going to have to deal with all the Robocop horror shit. So I think we can give him a pass here. We do have one more show to talk about before the pay-per-view. And I think next week is going to be a drinking game. Take a shot anytime they mention or say anything about Robocop. I know it's only an hour-long broadcast, I still might not make it out of that one alive. We are definitely seeing the result of what happens when you let clueless hacks take full control of the on-screen product. When you manage to piss off all the right parties and limit the entire booking team to dumb fucks. Now that Flair's officially off the booking committee and Hurt is overseeing the vast majority of what we see on the TV product, it's only fitting that Robocop becomes the central focus of the entire god-blessed show. Based on the execution of how that whole fiasco goes down, it is about what you would expect. Even if you haven't seen any of that footage before, trust me, I have a lot more to say about it when it comes. Well, we certainly had a lot of groundbreaking news with Midsouth television this week. A grim and somber start to the program. As we all know, based on what they've been developing between Skandar Akbar and Hacksaw Duggan as of late, Akbar made a pact that he would put Duggan out of commission for good. That he would find a way to end his wrestling career permanently. And based on the angle they shot during a Duggan versus Kamala match in Jackson, Mississippi, he very may well have done that. So let's talk about the big angle. Now, originally they were supposed to do Duggan versus Dr. Death in the semifinals to the TV title tournament this week, with the winner going on to face Jake Roberts in the finals. But because of what happened to Duggan and Jackson, that match is no longer taking place. And this incident involved General Akbar sending a fireball to Duggan's face during the middle of his match with Kamala. It resulted in Duggan being flown to a local burn unit for medical attention. Since that point, he was transported to Bixby, Oklahoma, where he's been undergoing continual treatment by the doctors. They are still unsure as to whether or not he'll be able to see ever again out of his left eye. But one thing is for certain, according to their diagnosis, his wrestling career as we know it is over. A tragic state of affairs. They went ahead and showed JR interviewing Duggan from his room. It really went heavily into detail of making the burn angle look legit too. They shaved off the entire left side of Duggan's beard, caked a bunch of makeup on to make it look like swelling and irritation. They obviously had him with the bandages to cover his eye and, well, practically the entire left side of his face. And Duggan did the sad promo here talking about how there's an old saying that big guys aren't supposed to be scared. But Duggan's man enough to look at his fans and say that he's absolutely scared. Not only for the fact that he may never be able to see out of his left eye again, but that he may never be able to step foot in a ring to compete. Right now, he's unsure of what to say, but he's putting faith in the doctors that they'll be able to save his vision and give him a second chance. And of course, Watts went ahead and put up the graphic for the address to where Duggan was allegedly staying. That way the fans could send him get well cards and flowers. I guess one would presume that they were putting faith in crazy fans not to show up to this address to cause problems. Which I guess wasn't all that likely considering it was an address in frickin' Bixby, Oklahoma of all places, where the population was probably less than 50 people. You never know. I mean, it could have also been a bogus address. But that was their big cold open this week, addressing the status of Duggan following this heinous terroristic act on behalf of Akbar. Like how Watts had to shoehorn his political agenda in there and talk about how guys like Akbar that adopt that Middle Eastern terrorist mindset, he probably thought nothing of it because it's built into their culture. By the way, I'm not implying that he's wrong. In fact, he's 100% correct. It always tickles me when the cowboy gets political on the wrestling show. He's definitely my kind of dude, though. Old school, button down, no nonsense, conservative, racist white dude. They also had a great shot of Watson Pierce right before they cut the break, looking deadpan into the camera with those deep scowls. By the way, I'm not downplaying any of this footage. It was all tremendously great stuff. I love the way Watts sold the gravity of everything that happened. And they went above and beyond to present this as a legit end of Duggan's career as we know it angle. When you think about it in context, in a wrestling culture now where guys are getting thrown off buildings and set on fire virtually every week, and they're back the following week like nothing ever happened. It is nice to go back and see when they treated these kinds of angles with severity. They even went so far as to have Watts cancel Kamala and Akbar's upcoming contracts, saying they're now banished from the Midsouth area because of what they did. Which I guess was his way to signify that they were wrapping up in the area for the time being. So this was all great. Loved all of this. I also love the promo that Ted DiBiase cut when they came back from break. First and foremost, important to mention, he and Dr. Death are now the new Mid-South Tag Team Champions after they knocked off the Rock and Roll Express. And the first thing DiBiase addressed here was Hacksaw Duggan. Unsurprisingly, he shared no condolences over what happened to him. Basically said that he's lucky it wasn't DiBiase that did it to him, and that Akbar should congratulate himself on getting the job done. What a ruthless prick. And that wasn't even the best part of his rant. The best part was when he started talking about being banned from Mid-South for 30 days, and how he made such little money in the Mid-South area as it was. He had to go wrestle in Japan and eat rice for a month just to make a steady income. Like the fact that he said that right in front of fucking Bill Watts, it was priceless. It was like, tell me you're still in character without directly telling me you're breaking character. I've got a great idea. I'm going to stand 2 feet from my boss and complain about being paid like shit for the last how many years. I'm sure that went over swimmingly with the cowboy. And so right as they pitched to the video in Houston where the heels won the straps, the story they drew attention to was DiBiase not coming out to wrestle with the orthopedic glove he had gotten permission to wear previously. His way of saying, if I came out with the glove on, the Mid-South Board of Directors would have come up with some lame excuse to screw me over. So I picked my spot and wore the glove when I needed it for protection. Right. And so as we see in the video, when DiBiase missed a charge and ran into the turnbuckle post, that allowed for Gibson to get the hot tag and run wild for a bit. Then as things broke down at the end, the Rock and Roll getting multiple visual pinfalls on Dr. Death, DiBiase capitalized on a ref distraction and slipped on the glove to punch out Gibson. And that way Dr. Death could get on top and steal the pin. And the belts. So DiBiase is laying out the playing field. While yes, they are obligated to give the Rock and Roll a rematch based on the contract clause they signed, they will agree to those terms. But if they can't beat DiBiase and Williams in their first opportunity, then they will never defend their titles against the Rock and Roll ever again. And in fact, to do one better, if they can't beat the Dirty White Boys in their scheduled match, they will also forfeit the right to challenge for the belts. So that was all well laid out. And the other big hurdle they needed to address here was the status of Dr. Death's tournament round with Duggan. It wasn't going to be easy enough for Duggan to simply advance via forfeit. And Midsouth went ahead and found Dr. Death a replacement opponent for later on. In his name, the Snowman. And more to come on that later on. I didn't like how DiBiase tried to object to Williams being forced to wrestle twice on the show. And the Cowboy basically chalked it up to, well, too damn bad. Because he's going to wrestle twice anyway. And the heels are like, fuck. And so that took us to the Dirty White Boys versus the Rock and Roll. As Ricky and Robert were dominating in the early goings, they showed Dirty Dutch on the floor scouting, which, now that I'm looking back, I'm pretty sure that's all he's done in Mid-South since his arrival. Aside from wrestling like one TV squash. He just comes out and stands behind the guardrail watching other dudes wrestle. No wonder he hated his time down there. Dude fucking barely did anything. So they tried to add the little caveat with the Rock and Roll needing to win this match in order to stay relevant in title contention. I don't think anybody actually expected Ricky and Robert to lose this match regardless. There was a funny chant that broke out when the heels were getting the heat on Ricky. The girls all chanted, "Go, Ricky, go!" Which was promptly followed with a loud vocal majority of the male audience screaming, "No!" You can clearly see the sex divide when it comes to the Rock and Roll's popularity amongst the male-female demographic. The men were not impressed. They did a cool little spot right before the Rock and Roll went over where the heels tried to use a leather belt to choke out Ricky. Then right as they shot Ricky off to do a double clothesline, Ricky jumped into the air and used the belt's momentum to pull Denton and Anthony into each other. Then they pinned Anthony with a double drop kick. Clever finish idea. Although a little campy in execution. But that promptly saves Ricky and Robert's title rematch. And it also continues the question of what the hell is Dutch Mantel's purpose in Mid-South Wrestling? Aside from giving him an extended paid vacation to do fuck all of nothing. So up next, well, we had the tournament round. And again, just to recap, they informed us that Dr. Death would be wrestling a replacement opponent, since Duggan is out with the injury. And they said that there's a newcomer in the Mid-South area that, quote, impressed the board of directors enough to where they were confident to put him in this TV title tournament despite, well, never having actually qualified and or won a single match on television prior. And to those that have never heard about the Snowman, to those that would not be able to pick him out of a police lineup, well, you're probably not the only one. So who was the Snowman? Aside from the cut and paste 200th failed JYD replacement in the last year. Well, his real name was Eddie Crawford. He was a Jerry Lawler pet project in Memphis going back to '84 when he was first breaking in. Probably his biggest claim to fame, and this is something that only true Memphis fans would know anything about, especially if you were actually watching or talking about the USWA in the 90s. There was a big blow-up between him and the Office where after they put the USWA world title on him, he tried to hold him up for more money because he thought he wasn't receiving good payouts for the events he was doing, despite that he really wasn't a draw as a champion to begin with. So he ended up walking out with the belt, and I think the rumor was he wound up selling it off at a pawn shop or something. But in the scope of his Mid-South run, I mean, the JYD comparison is pretty much his biggest claim to fame there. Yet again, Watts going back to the well with, what promising young black athlete can I force on the people to cheer for in order to replace the dog? Couldn't get it to work with Brickhouse Brown. Couldn't get it to work with Sonny King. Couldn't get it to work with anybody I've tried to put in that top spot. Now let's see if the Snowman makes any bit of difference. Well, it did not. To the shock of anybody with half a brain cell. In terms of his look, he was a decent athlete. Big guy. Somewhere in the ballpark of 250 pounds. Really good shape. But it all goes back to the cliche of putting lipstick on a pig. You can dress the situation up any way you want, but he just never connected with the Mid-South fans. Now, he got some occasional pops for the big moves he pulled off here, but to think he was ever going to connect on the same level as the dog was just asinine. Then, of course, there's the other problem here where they basically forced him over on Dr. Death and had him win flat in about 90 seconds. And this is something I've talked about on the channel before, the difference between a push and a force in wrestling. You know, a push is when you're trying to establish a guy and naturally get him over with proper development and timing. A force is what they did with the Snowman here. Having a guy show up from out of nowhere with no hype or fanfare, shoving him down everybody's throats when they weren't clamoring for it, then having him get a quick one over an already established top heel. And now, just like that, the Snowman is in the finals of the TV title tournament after having shown up 1 week and beating one opponent in the semifinal round. Literally from out of the woodwork. And I know it's easy enough for me to shit on all of this in hindsight, knowing that the Snowman's run in Mid-South was fairly unmemorable and lackluster. But I don't know, dude. I mean, like at that point, they may as well have just put Brickhouse Brown in that spot. At least he was someone they were already featuring on TV. The Snowman thing is just... I mean, I really don't know how else to put it. It's another example of Bill Watts showing his bitter attitude toward the way the dog left. And his determination to try to get the fans to forget about his existence. When in actuality, all he did was remind people that the dog can never be replaced. So like I said, he advances in the finals with Jake next week. And now that I'm reliving all this again, I'm like 99% sure he's going to end up beating Jake Roberts to win the title next week. See, I remember the Snowman. I didn't remember him debuting in the middle of the TV title tournament. But it's all starting to make sense now because I've already been kind of skeptical about the idea of Jake winning the title. How it all came across like it was going to be a giant swerve. Because they were getting you to think for months that Jake would finally win the title. Remember, he kept coming out on television and complaining about getting screwed over left and right. Now that he's actually in the finals, well, here's this Snowman fella coming at the last minute that'd probably steal it away from him. Again, I don't know if that's what ends up happening, but it would not surprise me if it did. Then we came back for Brad Armstrong and Mike Jackson versus another fun, interesting crossover here to the Mid-South area. The Fabulous Freebirds. And no, this is not the Freebird 2.0 experiment from WCW. No Jimmy Garvin here. This is the real deal. This is Michael Hayes and Buddy Roberts. With Terry Gordy conspicuous by his absence. Trying to think where Gordy would have been during this time that he didn't show up with Hayes and Roberts here. It was 1985. So if he wasn't in Dallas, he had to have been in Japan, right? Of course, as soon as I saw Hayes come out, started having immediate flashbacks to when Watts was cutting promos on him last year, calling him a sissy any chance he got. Like him and Cornette, those are the two guys Watts was always referring to as sissies. Now, if you follow the world-class review series I did on the channel for the last several years, I've given plenty of deep dive analyses on the Freebirds. They were quite literally the glue that held world-class together, especially during the peak years. Them and the Von Erichs, man. By this point in 85, they had somewhat toned down the Von Erich Freebird feud and started to change up the main event picture a little bit. Because I think the Freebirds had left Dallas full-time by that point. I always liked the combination of Roberts and Hayes in a tag team setting. Like Roberts, even at this point, he could still move pretty well. Even though he had definitely started to slow down by that late 84 time frame. It was obviously a showcase match for the Birds. And they were only in there for a handful of dates. Funny thing is, by this point, the fans had already seen a lot of Freebird footage out there. And because they weren't in Dallas in front of that super hostile Sportatorium crowd, they actually had a decent amount of fans here. There were plenty of Freebirds chants that broke out throughout this match. Of course, they were all the dudes. But they took turns working over Armstrong and Jackson. Like the finish where Hayes went to ram Jackson into Roberts' head. That way he could set him up for the Bulldog and get the pinfall. I was tempted to say he used Buddy's loaded head to steal the win. Yeah, apparently Buddy was hiding a giant block of cement under that head of hair. Hair that he had fully grown back by this point. He was no longer having to wear that goofy wig and helmet to hide his bald head after he got it shaved in Dallas the year prior. It's crazy how I still remember stuff like that. I mean, it is a very iconic run. Like Buddy Roberts going out there for months on end with all the top baby faces trying to pull off that stupid fucking blonde wig. never gets old. I mean, I truly could spend an hour glossing up the Freebirds if I wanted, but with all those world-class episodes we reviewed, just go listen to those if you want to hear me rave about how great they were. We had Jake Roberts versus Mark Reagan. I wrote down Mike Reagan multiple times here, but pretty sure it was Mark. Shows how much of an impact he left. It was not quite a squash match, but Roberts still wound up going over relatively easily. Now that I'm thinking about it, wasn't Mark Reagan the goofball that came out weeks ago with a fucking boombox and did the dance-off right before his match? Talk about things that got over like a wet fart in church. Jake should have beat him quicker than he did. And that left us with Dr. Death and Ted DiBiase versus Steve Casey and Ken Glover in the closing standby. You know, Williams was oddly gleeful after having been knocked off by the newcomer in the TV title tournament 10 minutes prior. Just throwing it out there. They spent the first few minutes with Casey outshining the heels. And as soon as Glover tagged in, the heels immediately took over and spent the next minute beating the piss out of him. DiBiase got the win with a figure 4. And because they had a few minutes of remaining airtime left, they used that gap to show another tribute package for Hacksaw Duggan, just to try to bring a lot of that earlier stuff to closure. I think a lot of it was reused video footage they aired when Duggan turned babyface for the first time a couple years ago. Like right after he broke away from the Rat Pack. I specifically remember the shots of him riding his pickup truck down those dirt roads in Oklahoma. And the rest of it was him in matches or marching around with his 2x4. A couple shots of him in front of the American flag, putting over how great the country is. It was good stuff, man. He was a true patriot. And it's like I talked about with Watts and Pierce earlier. They're treating this storyline like it's a genuine tragedy. The idea that Duggan may never wrestle again. I mean, you think with the amount of focus they devoted to it, you'd have thought the guy was fucking dead. And obviously, as we all know, this did not signify the end of Duggan's in-ring career. But seeing them treat it like a true end-of-an-era type situation, shows how much of a legacy Duggan's left in Midsouth. Like seeing where he started to where he was right before Akbar burned his face with a fireball, it is a true hero's evolution type storyline. Like Duggan used to be one of the top villains in Midsouth. And now he's considered one of the all-time top babyfaces. I mean, everything they did with the presentation of that was spot on perfect. And I really can't say enough good things about this week's show. Like, even looking past all the Duggan material, he had some great wrestling this week, good promo work, especially with DiBiase. Yeah, there's all the stuff with the snowman, which thankfully didn't last all that long. It was another experiment that quickly ran its course. But the TV title tournament is coming to closure. I'm still thinking that Jake doesn't walk out with the title next week, but maybe I'm wrong. We'll see. But that is going to wrap it up for now. As always, I want to thank everybody that comes back to check out the 5 Starr Wrestling Report every week. Make sure you subscribe, comment, and give the show a like. Like I said, you could check us out on either YouTube or Rumble. I seem to be getting back into the flow of consistent podcasting. There's going to be that loophole with the Friday show next week because I'm going to be out of town that weekend, but I'm going to make it work. I'm going to do the Capital Combat pay-per-view recap that Friday, and well, like I said, I'll make it work. But I will catch you guys all on Monday when we do Retro Raw. And that's it for now. I'll talk to you all soon. Thanks, everybody. Take care and peace out.